John Wayne Gacy was born at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, Illinois, on March 17, 1942, the second of three children and only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robison. His father was an auto repair machinist and World War I veteran, and his mother was a homemaker. Gacy was of Polish and Danish ancestry, and his family was Catholic. Gacy was close to his mother and two sisters, but had a difficult relationship with his father, an alcoholic who was verbally and physically abusive to his family. The elder Gacy frequently belittled his son, calling him dumb and stupid, and comparing him unfavorably with his sisters. One of Gacy's earliest childhood memories was of his father beating him at age 4 for accidentally disarranging car engine components. His mother tried to shield her son from his father's abuse, which resulted in accusations that he was a sissy and a mama's boy who would probably grow up queer. In 1949, Gacy's father whipped him after he and another boy were caught sexually fondling a young girl. The same year, a family friend began to occasionally molest Gacy. Gacy never told his father, afraid that his father would blame him. Despite their challenging relationship, Gacy loved his father but felt he was never good enough in his father's eyes. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, tortured and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in Norwood Park Township, near Chicago, Illinois. He became known as the Killer Clown due to his public performances as a clown prior to the discovery of his crimes. Gacy committed all of his known murders inside his ranch-style house. Typically, he would lure a victim to his home and dupe them into donning handcuffs on the pretext of demonstrating a magic trick.
Knots in general. Catch his sense of humor.
Shoelaces, huh? You're in trouble now.
Yeah, right.
Aren't you afraid sitting that close to me? What the hell? Oh, this is too long. You don't need it this long. Okay. I had a rosary, which I carried in my pocket. I've always carried a rosary. It was my communion rosary. They said, well, what kind of a knot do you use? I said, what do you mean knot? When I tie things up? I said, depending on what I'm using it for, I said, the only thing I ever learned from Boy Scouts was a tourniquet knot. He said, well, show us what that is. So I took, at that time, and again, it's together, but in order to demonstrate it here, I took the rosary and I said, well, here, you put it around. This is hard trying to do this. Why don't you put your hand out? Okay, here. What I told him, I said, here, all you do is you wrap it around, you put one knot in it. And I said, then you put a second knot in it. Okay? I said, then you take a stick and stick it in here, and you just turn this. And I said, it causes a tourniquet. I said, that's the only knot I ever learned.
Precisely the kind of knot found on the ropes wrapped around the necks of the victims found under the house on Summerdale.
He would then rape and torture his captive before killing his victim by either asphyxiation or strangulation with a garrote. 26 victims were buried in the crawl space of his home, and 3 were buried elsewhere on his property, 4 were discarded in the Des Plaines River. Gacy had previously been convicted in 1968 of the sodomy of a teenage boy in Waterloo, Iowa, and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, but served 18 months. He murdered his first victim in 1972, had murdered twice more by the end of 1975, and murdered at least 30 victims after his divorce from his second wife in 1976. The investigation into the disappearance of Des Plaines teenager Robert Piest led to Gacy's arrest on December 21, 1978. His conviction for 33 murders, by one individual, then covered the most homicides in United States legal history. Gacy was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980. He was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center on May 10, 1994. His victims included people he knew and random individuals lured from Chicago's Greyhound bus station, Bughouse Square, or off the streets with the promise of a job with PDM, an offer of drink and/or drugs, or money for sex. Some victims were grabbed by force, others were conned into believing Gacy, who often carried a sheriff's badge and had spotlights on his black Oldsmobile, was a policeman. Gacy usually lured a lone victim to his house, although on more than one occasion Gacy had what he called doubles, 2 killed in the same evening. Inside Gacy's home, his usual modus operandi was to ply a youth with drink, drugs, or generally gain his trust. He would then produce a pair of handcuffs to show a magic trick, sometimes as part of a clowning routine. He typically cuffed his own hands behind his back, then surreptitiously released himself with a hidden key. He then offered to show his intended victim the trick. With his victim restrained, Gacy proceeded with rape and torture. He frequently began by sitting on or straddling his victim's chest before forcing the victim to fellate him. Gacy then inflicted acts of torture including burning with cigars, making his captive imitate a horse as he sat on their back and pulled on makeshift reins around their necks, and violation with foreign objects such as dildos and prescription bottles after he had sodomized his captive. Gacy frequently manacled his captive's ankles to a 2x4 with handcuffs attached at each end, an act inspired by the Houston mass murders. He also taunted many victims throughout their abuse, and was known to have partly drowned several in the bathtub before repeatedly reviving them. Gacy typically murdered his victims by placing a rope tourniquet around their neck and progressively tightening it with a hammer handle. He referred to this as the rope trick, frequently informing his victim, "This is the last trick." Occasionally, the victim convulsed for an hour or two before dying, although several victims died by asphyxiation from cloth gags stuffed deep in their throats. Except for his two final victims, all were murdered between 3 o'clock and 6 a.m. Gacy usually stored the victims' corpses under his bed for up to 24 hours before burying them in the crawl space, where he periodically poured quicklime to hasten decomposition. Some were taken to his garage and embalmed prior to burial. Murder of Timothy McCoy. Gacy's first known murder occurred on January 3, 1972. According to Gacy's later account, following a family party the previous evening, he drove to the Civic Center in the Loop in the early morning to view a display of ice sculptures. He then lured 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy from Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal into his car. McCoy was on his way to his father's home in Omaha, Nebraska, and informed Gacy his bus was not due until noon. Gacy took McCoy on a sightseeing tour of Chicago and then drove him to his home with the promise that he could spend the remainder of the night and be driven back to the station in time to catch his bus. Prior to McCoy's identification, he was known as the Greyhound bus boy. Gacy claimed he woke early the following morning to find McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway holding a kitchen knife. He jumped from his bed and McCoy raised both arms in a gesture of surrender, accidentally cutting Gacy's forearm. Gacy disarmed McCoy, banged his head against the bedroom wall, and kicked him against his wardrobe. McCoy kicked Gacy in the stomach, doubling him over. Gacy then grabbed McCoy, wrestled him to the floor, and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest. As McCoy lay dying, Gacy claimed he washed the knife in his bathroom, then went to his kitchen and saw the makings of breakfast on the table. McCoy had set the table for two. He had walked into Gacy's room to wake him while absent-mindedly carrying the knife. Gacy buried McCoy in his crawl space and later covered his grave with a layer of concrete. In an interview several years after his arrest, Gacy said that immediately after killing McCoy, he felt totally drained, yet noted that as he stabbed McCoy and listened to the gurgulations and gasping, he had experienced a mind-numbing orgasm. He added, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." Gacy said he committed murder for the second time around January 1974. This victim remains unidentified. He was strangled and placed in Gacy's closet before burial. Gacy later stated that bodily fluids leaked from the victim's mouth and nose, staining his carpet. Gacy regularly stuffed rags, the victim's own underwear, or a sock into the mouths of subsequent victims to prevent such a leakage. On July 31, 1975, John Butkovich, an 18-year-old PDM employee, disappeared. 97. Butkovich's car was later found abandoned with his jacket and wallet inside and the keys in the ignition. The day before his disappearance, Butkovich had confronted Gacy over outstanding back pay. Butkovich's father called Gacy, who claimed he was happy to help search for his son, but was sorry Butkovich had run away. When questioned by police, Gacy said Butkovich and two friends had arrived at his house demanding the overdue pay, but they had reached a compromise and all three had left. Over the following 3 years, Butkovich's parents called police more than 100 times, urging them to investigate Gacy further. Gacy later admitted to encountering Butkovich exiting his car, waving to attract his attention. According to Gacy, Butkovich approached him, stating, "I want to talk to you." Gacy invited Butkovich into his car, then invited him back to his home, ostensibly to settle the issue of his overdue wages. At his home, Gacy offered Butkovich a drink, then conned him into allowing his wrists to be cuffed behind his back. Gacy later confessed to having sat on the kid's chest for a while before he strangled him. He stowed Butkovich's body in his garage, intending to bury the body later in the crawl space. When his wife and stepdaughters returned home earlier than expected, Gacy buried Butkovich under the concrete floor of the tool room extension of his garage in an empty space where he had intended to dig a drain tile. On the afternoon of December 11, 1978, Gacy visited the Nissan pharmacy in Des Plaines to discuss a potential remodeling deal with the store owner, Phil Torf. While he was within earshot of 15-year-old part-time employee Robert Piest, Gacy mentioned his firm often hired teenage boys at a starting wage of $5 per hour, almost double the pay Piest earned at the pharmacy. Shortly after Gacy left, Piest's mother arrived at the store to drive her son home so the family could celebrate her birthday together. Piest asked his mother to wait, adding that some contractor wants to talk to me about a job. He left the store at 9 p.m., promising to return shortly. Piest was murdered shortly after 10 p.m., at Gacy's home. Gacy later stated that at his house, he gave Piest a soft drink before asking whether there was anything he wouldn't do for the right price, to which Piest replied that he did not mind working hard. In response, Gacy stated good money could be earned by hustling, although Piest was dismissive. Gacy then duped Piest into donning handcuffs. Gacy's subsequent statements regarding the events varied, although in one of his initial statements, he claimed Piest failed to resist as he removed the boy's trousers. He also stated that as he placed the rope around Piest's neck, the boy was crying, scared. Gacy admitted to having received a phone call from a business acquaintance as Piest lay dying. On the morning of May 9, 1994, Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, French fries, a dozen deep-fried shrimp, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. That evening, he received the last rites from a Catholic priest before being escorted to the Stateville execution chamber. In the hours leading up to Gacy's execution, a crowd estimated at over 1,000 gathered outside the correctional center. A vocal majority were in favor of the execution, although a small number of anti-death penalty protesters were present. Some of those in favor of the execution wore T-shirts hearkening to Gacy's previous community services as a clown and bearing satirical slogans such as "No Tears for the Clown." Before the execution began, the chemicals used to effect the execution solidified unexpectedly, clogging the 4-tube. The execution team replaced the clogged tube and the execution resumed. The entire procedure took 18 minutes. Anesthesiologists blamed the problem on the prison officials' inexperience at conducting an execution. This error apparently led to Illinois adopting an alternative method of lethal injection. One prosecutor at Gacy's trial, William Kunkel, said, "He got a much easier death than any of his victims." According to published reports, Gacy was a diagnosed psychopath who did not express any remorse for his crimes. His final statement to his lawyer before his execution was that killing him would not compensate for the loss of others, and that the state was murdering him. His final spoken words were reported to be "kiss my ass," although prosecutor William Kunkel stated in 2020 that these words were spoken to a prison official and were not part of any official statement prior to Gacy's execution. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, his brain was removed. It is in the possession of Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at Gacy's trial, who has interviewed Gacy and other serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits of violent sociopaths. His body was cremated. In 1984, Sam Amir anti-authored procedures that were incorporated by the Illinois General Assembly into the Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984. At the time of the Gacy murders, Illinois police had to wait 72 hours before initiating a search for a missing child or adolescent. The Missing Child Recovery Act removed this waiting period. Other states subsequently adopted similar procedures. As a result, a national network aimed at locating missing children was gradually formed. This has since developed into the child abduction emergency, commonly known as an Amber Alert. Only 28 of Gacy's victims have been conclusively identified. The youngest were Samuel Stapleton and Michael Marino, both 14, the eldest were Francis Alexander and Russell Nelson, both 21.